Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today I want to talk about a lesser known but very powerful tool that we have inside GarageBand. That tool is called an expander. An expander is a version of a noise gate. You might have heard of a noise gate before, but if you haven't, a noise gate is essentially a plugin that would allow for anytime sound to get beyond a certain level, gates open up and it lets us sound through. Anything below that certain level, the gates will close and we won't hear it anymore. So this can be really helpful if you've ever had a noisy guitar and you only want it to make noise when you're playing the guitar. But sometimes it can also be a little bit weird because let's say you have a sustained chord. Well, once it gets below the volume threshold, those gates are going to close and all of a sudden that chord is just going to go away. So that's not always going to be the best option for us. What I really like about an expander is it often is a little bit more natural. So an expander sets a threshold, same as a noise gate would, but when audio gets to that threshold, we're given a few choices in how we want it to behave. So we can either have it go all the way off, so the noise just would drop totally to zero, or we could have it naturally fall off, right? And that gives us a lot more flexibility, a lot more options, and a lot more ability to make it sound natural. So for example, I very, very often use some amount of an expander on a kick drum. And that's because if I have a live recorded kick drum, I have a mic inside of that kick drum all the time. It's getting all the noise of all the hits across the entire drum kit. And that's fine, that's natural, that's okay, that's not the end of the world. But if I really want that kick to cut through in the mix and sound huge, well, I might not want as much of that sound that's in between all the kick drum hits to be as prominent in that source. So for this example, let's go ahead and just dive in and start talking about the parts of an expander and how you can use it to create more definition between your kick hits and your snare hits and anything that you might have in your mix. But keep in mind that you could go use this on anything you have in your source as well. So in your song, if you have a guitar that has a little bit of noise and you want it to naturally fade off in between, you could use the expander to do that. Or if you have a vocal and you have a little bit of click bleed, well, one, I would recommend cutting out any audio in between the parts where you're singing. But two, if you want to naturally fall off in between, you could use the expander to just quickly turn down anytime you're not singing. And that can really help that out and minimize any sort of bleed from your headphones into your vocal mic. So let's go ahead and dive in on this kick example though. So right now this kick drum sounds like this. It sounds good, but you hear there's a lot of stuff in between, right? So we're going to go pull up this expander, and it's not called an expander. It's under audio units, so it's not where our main plugins are. It's under audio units, under Apple, and it's called the audynamicsprocesser. Now, if you saw last week's video, we dove into the other side of this plugin. This plugin is actually two plugins in one. It's a compressor and an expander. If you haven't seen last week's video where we go all inside the compressor side of this plugin, definitely check that out. I'll link to it above. Very, very helpful. It's a great compressor. This week, we're going to ignore the compression side, which is this side of the plugin. We're just going to focus on the bottom part of this plugin here. This little second dot here is our expansion threshold. You can see it says it right there. And what that means is that's just that line. So any sound below that threshold is going to get turned down. And then we have a ratio that determines how extreme it will be turned down. So that's what this second little dot in the bottom corner here is for us. So right now, if we're listening to the kick, it doesn't make a difference where that threshold is, or if I even turn this plugin off in general, it doesn't make any sort of difference. And that's because it's set without any sort of ratio. So right now it's just an even line. It's just going to say, okay, well, we're just going to say the same volume. So what we want to do is set this ratio to tell it to turn down. So if we're setting it, listen to how different it sounds as I set this really extreme. Crazy, right? So we turn that off. So right now it's basically a noise gate. It just turns off anything that's not at that threshold. But if we want it to sound a little bit more natural, where it's just reducing the things in between, we can set this ratio wherever we want it to be, set the threshold till it sounds the most natural to us. And now we've just created a little bit more space in that low end where there's less rumble from everything else, and this kick can cut through a little bit better in the mix. Another example of this on the snare drum right now, there's a fair amount of hi-hat bleed. The hi-hat mic is right next, or the hi-hat is right next to the snare mic, so listen to this. We put an expander on it. it doesn't make the hi-hat go away because that would sound unnatural. If I were to set this like a noise gate, it's kind of hard to make that sound really natural, right? But if I just have it expanding, still sounds very natural, but it's reducing that hi-hat volume quite a bit in between. So again, it's not going to make it go all the way away, but that's not necessarily always the goal. But you can set it to be a noise gate if you find that that's what you'd like. Now, some other expanders allow you to set where this floor is, like how low it will actually turn down. So you could set it where it won't go all the way off, but it will only go down a little bit. That can be really helpful too. But this expander doesn't have it, and that's okay. Use what you got. Now, one thing that's important to note about any sort of gate or expansion is that there might be times in your song where your audio isn't even reaching that threshold, but you want it to be playing. And there's a way to deal with this, right? So this kick drum, if we go a little bit later in the song here, we're doing a bit of a build up. And this kick drum here, right now, it sounds a little weird. That's because it's below our threshold. So it's being turned down. Sounds a little bit more natural here if we just turn that all the way off. Well, so what we can do is we can actually automate this threshold. So if we hit A on our keyboard to bring up our automation, well, we can go into this plugin and we can find the expansion threshold. And what I can do is I can just set parameters here and go to the beginning of this bridge, and I can just tell that threshold to come way down. So it will stay where it was for this section here, and then the second we get to this little section right here, drops down. So then when I get to that build up, it's not infecting it at all. Really, really helpful. Now, an expander is a great plugin. I definitely recommend you check it out if you have any sources that you think this might help on. Again, this is powerful. It's free inside GarageBand, but it's not necessary to create a professional sounding mix inside GarageBand. There's 6 steps that every professional mix has, and you can do all 6 of them inside GarageBand. I've put together something to help you with that. I've put together a 6-step checklist that just walks through all the 6 steps that all professional mixes have, all the 6 components, and how you can do them inside GarageBand. It's completely free from the link in the description below, so be sure to grab that. If this video is helpful for you, be sure to subscribe. And before we go, I want to hear from you. Do you use any sort of noise gates or expanders inside GarageBand? Do you use the stock Dynamics processor or the noise gate? Or do you use any third-party plugins that help you do expansion inside GarageBand? Let me know in the comments below. Again, if this video is helpful, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.